The Buffalo Bills added 3 veterans to the roster in defensive end Dawuane Smoot, wide receiver Chase Claypool, and linebacker Deion Jones. I'm breaking down what you need to know about those signings today on Locked On Bills.
You are Locked On Bills, your daily Buffalo Bills podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, Bills Mafia? It's Joe Marino, author of Go Bills and Buffalo's Run, also the co-host of the Locked On NFL Scouting Podcast, and I'm your host of Locked On Bills. Want to thank you for making Locked On Bills your first listen every day, and a big welcome and shout out to our everydayers. You know who you are. Those of you who never miss a single episode, I appreciate y'all being here very, very much. I'd also like to invite you to subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Well, folks, welcome in. Brandon Beane signed 3 players on Friday, and so we got to talk about these new additions to the roster, break down the important stuff and how it affects the landscape of those particular position groups and this overall roster, where it's at. So let's get into it. And I first want to start by acknowledging a very important piece of information for this point in the calendar. At this point, the players that you sign do not factor into the compensatory draft pick formula. So these players that the Bills sign today and the players they will sign moving forward do not count against that formula. And so with that in mind, we've seen a complete look at the players in versus the players out that qualify towards the compensatory pick formula. And both Lance Zierlein of NFL.com and overthecap.com have the Bills receiving a 4th and a 5th round compensatory pick in the 2025 NFL draft. They're expected to get a 4th rounder for losing Gabe Davis and a 5th rounder for losing Leonard Floyd. And so that puts the Bills at a very strong draft capital position for next year. The Bills currently, assuming those 2 picks are true, have 10 selections in the 2025 NFL draft. Their own 1st round pick, their own 2nd round pick, the Vikings' 2nd round pick, their own 3rd and 4th round pick, a 4th round pick from the Chicago Bears, a 4th round compensatory draft pick, a 5th round compensatory draft pick, their own 6th, and the New York Giants' 6th round pick. Brandon Beane loaded with draft capital in 2025, assuming, of course, these compensatory picks land where we expect them to. 2 great sources are saying that this is going to be the case. In fact, there's some level of belief that based on how Tim Settle does for the Texans, the Bills could be looking at another 6th or 7th round compensatory pick. So Bills are looking good when it comes to the 2025 NFL draft. All right, let's get into the players that the Bills signed. And I want to start with the guy that I'm most excited about, and that is defensive end Dawuane Smoot. He's 29 years old. He actually just turned 29 back in March. So this is his age 29 season. Was a 3rd round pick, number 68 overall in 2017, out of Illinois. He's 6'3", 264 pounds, 33.25-inch arms, ran 4.77 in the 40 with a 1.68 10-yard split. Of course, the Jaguars picked him in the 3rd round back in 2017, and he has spent his entire career to this point with Jacksonville. He's played in 99 games with 17 starts. Took him a couple of years to get going in the NFL. Very quiet his first 2 seasons. And then from 2019 through 2022, he really emerged as a quality rotational piece of that Jacksonville defensive line. He had at least 5 sacks in each of those seasons from 2019 through 2022. He actually signed a 2-year, $10 million extension back after the 2021 season, and then unfortunately had an Achilles injury in 2022 late in the season that really took away from what he was last year. And so he started the 2023 campaign on the physically unable to perform list, and then he eventually was activated, and it just wasn't his best season. I personally really like this move. I've been a fan of Smoot for a while. I feel like in at least a couple of the recent mock off seasons, I have championed the idea of signing Dawuane Smoot. And so it finally comes to fruition here entering 2024. Also a note here on Dawuane Smoot. He was the Jaguars 2023 Walter Payton Man of the Year nominee. So that would speak to him having great football character. In terms of what I think he adds to the Buffalo Bills, assuming that he can kind of get back to his pre-injury form, which now he'll be, 2 years removed from it, I think he can really elevate that Shaq Lawson role. That fourth defensive end, play really well against the run, but I think that he's been a much better pass rusher throughout his career than what we've seen from Shaq Lawson. And in my previous job, the Jacksonville Jaguars were part of my NFL scouting responsibility, so I watched a ton of Dawuane Smoot. I just think he's a quality football player. Again, assuming he can get back to his pre-injury form. So the outlook here for the Bills at defensive end is pretty interesting. There's a lot of good competition for the last few spots that'll make this roster. You traditionally think the Bills will keep 5 defensive ends, maybe 6. And this is what that landscape looks like right now. Of course, your roster locks, I think there's 3 of them. Greg Rousseau, Von Miller, AJ Epinesa. I think those guys are absolute roster locks. And then from there, you have a good mix of players in competition for the last 2, maybe 3 spots if you keep 6. So you have Dawuane Smoot, of course, now part of the mix. Casey Toohill, who they signed from Washington. Javon Solomon, a draft pick, a day 3 draft pick out of Troy. Kingsley Jonathan, who was on the roster last year. And then Cameron Klein, who's been on the practice squad. So I think you have this mix of Smoot, Toohill, Solomon, and Jonathan competing for 2 spots, maybe 3. And I think that's a pretty good mix of competition. Now, you wish that you knew what you were going to get out of Von Miller, right? That would certainly help this conversation in terms of what you have at the top of the depth chart. But I think those last 3 spots, you have a really healthy mix of competition. And one thing that I think is going to absolutely factor into this equation is special teams. And I know that you traditionally don't think about defensive ends factoring in on special teams, but the Bills have used that, right? Darryl Johnson has done it. Kingsley Jonathan has done that for the Bills, but also this new kickoff rule where it is, you're not running, sprinting down the field. You're starting like face to face with each other. Your ability to take on those blocks and get off the blocks, not much unlike an outside run play, which defensive ends defend all the time. And so I would not be surprised if the Bills wind up going a little heavier at defensive end, keeping in mind you're going to need those players to take on blocks, get off blocks, use their length with this new kickoff rule. So I think that absolutely factors into this. Now, obviously, the most important thing is how they play defensive end. Can they affect the passer? Can they defend the run? All that's going to be most important. But if things are close and they're sorting things out between Smoot, Toohill, Solomon, and Jonathan, it's who gives you the best combination of defensive end play and special teams. So something to really keep an eye on as the Bills work through this offseason, of course, through training camp and the preseason. I think you've got a really, really healthy situation at the bottom of your defensive end depth chart. All right, folks, I want to get into Chase Claypool and, of course, Deion Jones, so be sure to stick with me. It's winner take all time in the NBA and NHL, and FanDuel is giving you a shot to bring home a huge win of your own. Right now, new customers can get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, and more. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make every playoff shot count. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. All right, game off. We got to pause here to talk more about Monopoly Go. I know what you're saying, flag on the play. You've already talked about that, but there's just so much good stuff in this game. In Monopoly Go, you can team up with friends for time tournaments where you work together to build up each other's boards. The more you win together, the more awesome prizes you unlock, and there's so much that you can get, like unique stickers. You can trade with friends to complete albums for big prizes, cool new playing pieces to travel boards with, and hilarious emojis for taunting friends when you smash their buildings or heist their vaults. Plus, Monopoly Go feels new and exciting every day with constantly changing tournaments and challenges. There's always something fun to discover in Monopoly Go, so get off the bench and go download it now free on Google Play or the App Store. Game on. All right, folks, the Bills added 2 more players, wide receiver Chase Claypool and linebacker Deion Jones. We're going to get into them now. Wide receiver Chase Claypool, 25 years old. He turns 26 in July, so this will be his age 26 season. Was a second-round pick in 2020, number 49 overall out of Notre Dame by the Pittsburgh Steelers. 6'4", 230 pounds, 32 plus inch arms, ran 4.42 in the 40 with a 40.5-inch vertical jump. This guy has size and speed and explosiveness for sure. That's absolutely part of what Chase Claypool brings to the table. Had a big last season for Notre Dame, 1,000 yards and 13 touchdowns his last season for the Irish. And then, of course, he's a second-round pick, had a really good rookie season for the Steelers, 932 yards and 11 touchdowns as a rookie. Then in 2021, 885 yards, but only 2 touchdowns. But then the wheels fell off, folks, and I mean they crashed in a big way starting in 2022 and through 2023. So after 2 good seasons to start his career as a second-round pick for Pittsburgh, they wind up trading him in 2022. They actually got a really nice pick. They got a second-round pick from the Bears, which wound up being the 32nd pick in the draft. Of course, the Dolphins had to forfeit their first-round pick, so there's only 31 first-round picks that year. So they got pick 32 from Chicago for Chase Claypool. And, of course, he didn't really do anything for Chicago. It was very disappointing. There was a lot of questions about his effort, and that actually showed up in Pittsburgh as well, which led to the trade. But he goes to Chicago and effort issues. He spoke very openly about his frustrations with the coaching staff and saying that they're not putting him in position to be successful. Then the coaching staff said, you can stay home. And the next thing you know, they trade him away. So, not even a year after giving up a second-round pick for him, they send him to Miami in October of 2025 for October of 2023 for a late-round pick swap in 2025. It was like Chase Claypool and a 7 for a 6 in 2025. So they just wanted him out of there, right? It was very a big distraction for that team last year. So he goes to Miami and he gets a chance to play a little bit. They needed some depth at receiver with some of the injuries that they had at the position. He winds up catching 1 pass during his, 11 games for the Dolphins or something like that. And then he had a total of 18 catches in 10 games that he appeared in for Chicago after they traded a second-round pick for him. So there's no denying the size and athleticism that exists with Chase Claypool. The dude just has a lot to prove. And the question is, can the Bills unlock it? You hear Sean McDermott talk about guys coming in and being the best version of themselves. Well, it'd be pretty cool if that would happen for Chase Claypool. However, the best predictor of future performance is past performance. And the last 2 years for Chase Claypool have been an absolute disaster, not only in the way that he's played, but in the rifts that have come with his relationship with both the Steelers and the Bears. And then, of course, the Dolphins chose not to bring him back. So what Chase Claypool brings to the table, size, athleticism, the kind of player that, you'd like to think can win leverage battles. And when he's able to run in a straight line, he's got a lot of juice and explosiveness about him. And so this very much kind of leans into some of the size that the Bills have added to the wide receiver core this offseason, of course, with Keon Coleman, Quintez Cephas, Mack Hollins, and then, of course, they brought in Chase Claypool. So looking at the wide receiver situation in Buffalo, the Bills will keep 5 or 6 receivers. I think you have 4 roster locks in Keon Coleman, Khalil Shakir, Curtis Samuel, and Mack Hollins. I think people are absolutely sleeping on Mack Hollins and him being the wide receiver 4 and a special teams ace and big-time asset as a blocker and size and ball skills as well. Please stop sleeping on Mack Hollins. But then I think you have a nice group, kind of like we talked about at defensive end, a nice mix in competition for wide receiver 5 and 6, assuming they do keep 6 receivers. You have in this mix for 1 or 2 roster spots, Justin Shorter, who was a 5th-round pick, height, weight, speed guy himself, has a lot to prove, but was a recent 5th-round pick. He was on IR all of last year. I don't think he was actually injured. I think the Bills were stashing him with that hamstring injury. I think he needed time. He needed a redshirt year, and the Bills found a way to get that done. We'll see what he can do in year 2. Quintez Cephas, who I talked about earlier this week on the podcast, a player I liked a ton at Wisconsin, that I liked with the Lions. There's some flags there, but certainly a guy that gives size, ball skills, consistent hands. Chase Claypool, who we just discussed. Then Andy Isabella, who spent last year on the practice squad. KJ Hamler, who signed this year to a futures contract back in January, who was a recent 2nd-round pick that's had injuries but has a lot of speed. Tyrell Shavers, who Brandon Beane has spoken very openly about, his commitment this offseason, how he's been in the facility working hard every day, certainly trying to make his best case to be a part of this roster. And then Brian Thompson, who was on the practice squad last year. So 1 or 2 spots for Justin Shorter, Quintez Cephas, Chase Claypool, Andy Isabella, KJ Hamler, Tyrell Shavers, Brian Thompson. It's a lot of good competition for those spots. And I think there's a lot of variety of skill sets. You have plenty of size guys. You have a couple of speed guys. There's some good variety there. Of course, I think just like with defensive ends, special teams will factor into this. Not that I see a lot of return upside in these players, but guys that you feel good about covering kicks and punts, right? That's what they're going to have to do. Being gunners, being jammers, that'll help really separate these guys and figure out who's going to make this roster. But, not that I have high expectations for Chase Claypool. I think he's got a lot in front of him to make this team, but he adds to this depth for one of these last 2 spots. And certainly a guy that's, looking at all these players, he's had more production in the NFL than any of them. And he certainly has a unique physical profile. Can he get it on track? You feel like he's got to be taking a real honest look at himself and realizing the hype that existed with him after 2 seasons and then what the last 2 seasons have looked like. And, it's do or don't time, right? Like this is it for him and a great opportunity. So hopefully you get the best version of Chase Claypool. The last player that the Bills signed that I'm going to talk about today is Deion Jones, a linebacker, 29 years old. He turns 30 in November. Was a 2nd-round pick in 2016, number 52 overall, out of LSU by the Atlanta Falcons. 6'1", 225 pounds, 32 3/8 on the arm length, ran a 4.38 40-yard dash. He's a really dynamic athlete, or at least he was when he was coming out of college back in 2016. He became an instant impact starter for the Atlanta Falcons, right? Quickly became one of the best linebackers in all of the NFL. And he really was from like 2016 through 2020. This was one of the better linebackers in the NFL, was a Pro Bowler, really high on the defensive rookie of the year balloting as well. He signed a big extension with Atlanta back in 2019. Remember 2019, 4 years, $57 million for a linebacker was a ton of money. And then unfortunately, he really started to decline in 2021 coincides with a shoulder injury that's really kind of was problematic for him in 2021 and 2022. And so he winds up actually getting traded to the Browns in 2022. He played in 11 games with 5 starts, and then he signed with Carolina last offseason, played in 13 games with 3 starts for the Carolina Panthers. So very experienced player, 91-game starter in the NFL, was part of some deep playoff runs with the Atlanta Falcons. But this is just not the same guy that he was earlier in his career. Things have really fallen off for him. I thought he had some decent moments with Carolina last year. But, it's hard to say where he's really at in his football journey just because that decline happened so quickly. And, of course, the shoulder injury, I think, fueled a lot of that. He has played Mike linebacker in the NFL to this point. I don't really have any concerns that he could play either the weak side or the middle linebacker role. He's got the type of athleticism that profiles well for a pursuit style role and doing matchup stuff and playing in space, but also obviously has a lot of experience playing in the middle. 2 thoughts here on this signing. Number one, and you see this happen all the time, when a team gets in trouble due to depth at a certain position, they correct that. And last year, the Bills' linebacker depth was a problem. Now, it just experienced way too much attrition, more than probably any team could handle. Matt Milano goes down in week 5. Then late in the season, Terrel Bernard has the ankle injury. He misses time in the playoffs, obviously. Tyrel Dotson has the shoulder injury. Balin Spector got hurt every single time he stepped on the field. And it got the Bills to the point where they're pulling A.J. Klein out of retirement and needing Tyrel Dotson to play with one arm in a playoff game against the Kansas City Chiefs. I'm sure that was sickening for Brandon Beane to build that type of roster to when it all matters, right? When it's the biggest moment, your linebackers are A.J. Klein and Tyrel Dotson with one arm. And so he's been on a mission to find linebacker depth this offseason. He's brought in a veteran in Nicholas Morrow. He's brought in Deion Jones. He drafted Dawuane Smoot. That's quite a bit of addition to the group. The other thought that I have here, and hopefully it's not true, is it certainly makes you wonder a little bit about Matt Milano. You know, how much of this is, okay, our linebacker depth was stressed last year and it got too problematic and it cost us a playoff game. Or is there some level of concern that we should have about Matt Milano? Obviously, tibial plateau fracture. Sounds like he was supposed to have a normal offseason. You see pictures of him working out. You know, I don't know, right? But you can at least, your mind probably wanders there. You speculate a little bit about, all right, should we be concerned? I'm going to have Dr. Kyle Trimble on a podcast episode very soon, maybe tomorrow, where we're going to talk about Matt Milano and other injury stuff with this team. So we'll find out a little bit more there, but surely your mind can wander there, and hopefully it's not true, but I at least think about it. So what's the linebacker outlook for this team right now? The Bills, I would think, will keep 6. Again, I'm not exactly sure how the new kickoff rule is going to impact some of those roster decisions. But when you look at this mix, and I talked about this before the draft, where the Bills were just really light on numbers at linebacker. Going into the draft, they only had 5. They only had 5 under contract. Now they're up to 7. So Matt Milano, Terrel Bernard, Dorian Williams, Nicholas Morrow, Dawuane Smoot, who was just a 5th-round pick, Deion Jones, and Balin Spector. I think Balin Spector is a player that intrigues this team, but he's just always having some type of injury, and he doesn't even really play. Your best ability is your availability, and Balin Spector just constantly being hurt. I do think that, Dorian Williams, fast physical player, but we saw last year, mentally, he's got a lot of work to do in terms of getting the speed of the game down and processing quicker. Dawuane Smoot, I'm excited for him. I was one of my favorite picks that the Bills made. But I think Nicholas Morrow and Deion Jones, as veteran players with a lot of experience, make a lot of sense to add to this depth, not only because you have a lot of youth, but because you saw how much of a problem linebacker depth was for you last year. Oh, by the way, this kickoff rule is definitely a thing you got to be mindful of. So there you have it, a little bonus Friday episode for you here. Brandon Beane said, you want a quiet, relaxing Friday? Well, you're not going to have one. Here's 3 players for you to talk about. And for that, I'm thankful. I'm always excited to talk Buffalo Bills, and was glad to get an opportunity in here to discuss the compensatory pick situation as well. Again, I'm going to talk to Dr. Kyle Trimble at some point in the very near future. We'll put out an episode for you there where we talk Milano, Von Miller, Spencer Brown had a procedure this offseason, and then just other thoughts on the players that were added in, injury concerns across the team, kind of a check-in on the health of the Buffalo Bills at this point in the offseason. So you have that to look forward to. And then, of course, you know how we go. Daily programming, daily content on the Buffalo Bills all year round. Doesn't matter if it's May, April, June, September. We are a daily podcast on the Buffalo Bills. So don't miss anything. Make sure that you're subscribed. Would love it if you took a second to rate, review, and share the podcast. Have a great rest of your day. Go Bills, and I look forward to catching up with you again real soon.